I'm so delighted to be having this discussion today. Today we're particularly focusing on the kind of creation and use of digital resources for research and teaching African studies. So thinking in the kind of broadest context about how digital material ends up being used in higher education in particular. And I guess in the 10 years since African Studies in the Digital Age was published, there's been a great deal of change in this area. I mean, not least because of the global pandemic, which I think really drove higher education practices and the practices of institutions with collections in very new directions. I think the Black Lives Matter movement had an enormous impact on higher education environments and curricula in the UK and North America, as well as on the research economy globally, which is not to say that things are by any means resolved, far from it, but there has been huge shifts in that context. And I think we've also seen a shift away from collection holders digitizing their own collections to other kinds of models, particularly an increase in academic publishers providing platforms for digital resources. We've seen the expansion of the work of Google Culture, and generally just the development of more platforms and technologies that allow for the integration of collections from different sites and sources. So with all of that in mind, we have a panel of fantastically interesting speakers today to present a little bit about their work and then to discuss some of the issues and opportunities that they can see in the field. First to speak today will be Elizabeth Robey, who's a publisher working with Africa Commons. She serves on the editorial team at Coherent Digital and has over 2 decades of experience in academic publishing and enjoys particularly working closely with faculty and librarians to develop products for teaching and research. And in particular, she's been working with the African Commons portfolio, which she will talk a little bit more about shortly. We also have with us today Professor Perpetua Dadzie, who is an Associate Professor of Information Science in the Department of Information Studies at the University of Ghana. And Perpetua has more than 2 decades of done more than 2 decades of research into information literacy in higher education, but also for schools across a wide range of disciplines, including medicine and psychology. She is currently managing editor for the Ghana Library Journal and was previously the University Librarian of the University of Ghana Library System between 2016 and 2021, and the head of the Department of Information Studies between 2013 and 2015. And she's also been working in libraries overseas, including Ghana, Honduras, and Jamaica. Also with us today, we have Dr. George Njung, who is turning over the page with my notes, Assistant Professor of African History at Baylor University in Texas, USA. His research focuses on the gender perspectives of the violence of colonialism and of the First World War in West Africa, and also focuses on historical approaches to African and migrant refugee experiences. He's published in the Journal of African History, Africa Today, Canadian Journal of African Studies, and several more important and prestigious journals. And his book, Violent Encounters, A Gendered History of the First World War in West Africa, is forthcoming in Ohio University Press. In addition to that, he has worked on the editorial board of a new database produced by Adam Matthew Digital, which he'll be explaining a little bit more about in due course. And finally with us today, we have Dr Siyabonga Njica, who is Postdoctoral Research Fellow in African Studies at the University of Cambridge. And his research interests include the histories of Black transnationalism in the 20th century, African and diasporic intellectual traditions, and the cultural Cold War. And his own research and teaching practice has drawn heavily on digital collections. And again, he will be providing some context to that before we invite everybody to explore some of the kind of questions that come out of these presentations. So what I'm going to do is now hand over to the speakers, who will each give a brief, about 5 to 8 minute presentation that describes some of their work and some of the kind of experiences that they're bringing to this discussion before we move on to pursue some of those questions together. So yeah, Elizabeth, it's over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz. And thank you to the entire SCOLMA committee, Liz, Jenny, Charles, Ben, for their coordination with our group today. And I think Jenny is going to share my slides. So she's just getting that up and getting it great. Does that work for everybody? Okay, I'll just assume that that's a yes. Oh, that's great. Yeah, it was just a little bit bigger. Thank you so much, Jenny. So you can already advance to the next slide. Thanks, Jenny. So Africa Commons is a collaborative project that I've been involved with for the last few years, along with a lot of other people. Our goal essentially is to index, preserve, and discover African cultural materials. And I'd like to get into a few details about the database in just a bit, but I wanted to share a little bit of history about how the project got started. Next slide. So, like so many projects we've been involved with, it just started with a conversation. Dr. Bougele Mabambo Tata is university librarian at the University of Lesotho, and Stephen Rintut is president of Coherent Digital, where I work. They met for the first time at a CLEAR meeting. That's Council on Library Information Resources. Dr. Bougele is chair of that group. And, you know, Dr. Bougele, as she likes to be referred to, speaks so passionately about the need to increase African knowledge in digital spaces. I think probably everybody on this call knows that Africa constitutes between I think it's between 17 and 20% of the world's population, but African knowledge is underrepresented in academic spaces. So from this initial conversation that they had, Stephen really felt like our Commons platform was uniquely positioned to help kind of close that representation gap. Next slide, please. So from there, Dr. Bougele recruited our wonderful board of advisors who have really helped guide us on this project for the last several years, including Dr. Perpetua Dadzie, who's part of our panel today. Next slide, please. So the database launched in late 2022. It is a full text index of openly available African digital content from around the world. So far you can see these numbers down here. We've indexed over 600 organizations, over 500,000 documents, which of course translates into millions of pages, along with video and audio recordings, and it's ever growing. So it's not a stagnant database. And, you know, it's one resource we hope will close that representation gap and make African knowledge more accessible and, you know, hopefully have a greater impact on the scholarly community. Next slide, please. It is free to all African institutions, as well as historically Black colleges and universities in the US. We also offer free hosting of content for those in Africa. 10% of sales are allocated for new digitization projects. And of course, all of this is available because it's supported by library subscriptions and one-time purchases primarily from Western institutions. So that's sort of our model, for lack of a better word. It's our model. Next slide, please. The content is vast, both in type, subjects, countries, time period. You can see the variety of content that's on the platform. And as I mentioned before, it's an ever-growing resource and constantly being updated. Next slide. So in terms of how it's created, so with recommendations from the scholarly community and our board, we select quality materials from openly available collections around the world. And then basically with a combination of both machine crawling as well as human work, we index these resources. The platform has a powerful search function, which includes Boolean operators that really help the user narrow down what they need. And then what we do is we link a user from our platform back to the original sites, driving traffic where the content resides. So we don't hold on to any content, we just find it. And so much, as we know, is hidden. We index it to make it more discoverable and then send users back to the original site. Next slide. So where rights permit, we maintain backup copies. So we all know websites go down, funding is lost, you know, you hit that 404, it's very frustrating. So we essentially have a safeguard with these backup copies that we can deploy if needed. I use Digital Innovation South Africa as an example. Their website has gone down twice in the last 18 months. Both times they were able to get it back up and running within like 36 hours, but we did have backup copies to deploy if there was a real delay. So there's that preservation aspect. There are a few other community engagement features I want to quickly touch upon because these actually do get a lot of attention. Uploads. Users can upload content themselves that they hold rights to, just uploading a PDF file to our platform, adding some metadata around it, and it's instantly on our platform. If you don't hold rights, you can submit a link to a website or an article. Again, we ask for just a little bit of metadata, and within a minute, it's listed on our platform. We do have a flag feature for anything that is questionable. People can flag content that they think might be questionable, and we'll get all of that information. The other feature of community engagement are the lists. These are actually quite popular. So users can make lists for teaching and research. So lists can be made around topics, subjects, a certain course you're teaching, a person, a time period. And it's just a great way to sort of organize the content, and you can share the list, with your students. You can keep it private for your research. You can share it with the whole community or just your institution itself. So these community engagement features have been quite popular with the platform. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. So I'll close with a quote from Dr. Bouglet, which I think is very powerful. And I just want to thank everyone for their attention. I look forward to listening to the others on the panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That's fantastic. And now we're going to hand over to Professor Perpetua Dadzie. And I think that I am going to be sharing the slides. So if you would give me one moment, I will bring those up.
So good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I am interested in this particular project because, as Elizabeth said, I'm a member of African Commons. So we're going to look at what we have at the University of Ghana, and then what patrons actually like about African Commons, and then also look at why African Commons is a go-to database. And then we'll look at a few issues which have come up and which our patrons would want us to consider. Next slide, please. Okay, so University of Ghana has diverse forms of platforms and digital resources. And I guess this link is being shared in your chat so that you will see the access to the various digital resources that we have. So we subscribe to several academic databases and digital libraries, such as JSTOR, Science Direct, Emerald, and what have you. The University of Ghana also has an institutional repository, which we call UG Space, where faculty and staff can access and share their research outputs. So in terms of their dissertation, in terms of their publications, yes, they can share them and then use that information. Also included in the UG Space is a place for where we have large data sets saved in there. So we have access to other digital repositories. We have access where we are able to collaborate with other data repositories. So we give a wide range of information to our faculty and students to enhance their teaching and to enhance their learning. Next slide. Okay, so another platform which is of interest to us, next slide. Yes, I think we've missed one, is our learning management system, which is the Sakai. So we have the learning management system, which is the Sakai, and the Sakai actually enhances students' learning. It handles faculty collaboration, discussions with students, just to enhance their curriculum. So they're able to learn in a digital environment with the Sakai. Then we also have, can you go to the next slide? We have access to open educational resources for the medical students as well as for the law students and faculty. Again, we have some specialized subject databases. So I was talking about the access to digital archives and museum collections, where the Institute of African Studies Library collaborates with cultural institutions such as the Manshia Archives to be able to help, especially those in the disciplines of history or anthropology and other subjects. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so what do patrons actually like about Africa Commons? We actually had an introduction to Africa Commons for faculty and for students, as well as the university community about Africa Commons. And then afterwards, I had to interview a few people to find out what they really like about Africa Commons. The first thing they mentioned was the multimedia content. So they had access to audiovisual, they had access to collections, images, documents, and all those things. So that was very interesting for them because they could embed all those different aspects of multimedia in their work. Then the ease of work, and then the link to original sites. That's what Elizabeth mentioned, which was very important to them. So the credibility and reliability, as well as the collaborative features. So the tools for annotation, for commenting, and for sharing. Next slide. There was also, they also mentioned advanced search and filtering options. And then for faculty, they were able to integrate some educational aspects of it into their curriculum. And of course, the multilingual support, because there are various languages can be found in African Commons. So they had access to Google where they were able to transcribe the information that they needed. Then, of course, they realized that the content is always updated, regular updates of the content. Next slide. So what makes Africa Commons a go-to database? As a matter of fact, most of them have mentioned what the patrons said. So the multimedia content, the archival documents where they have access to oral histories, recordings of videos, and the rest. And then the collaborative tool. So you have the list builder, which allows them to create their list and then share. Next slide. Community engagement was very important for them because they were able to link up with other people. The language support was also good for them. Then the metadata and cataloging, this was for the librarians, and they really enjoyed doing the simple metadata and then the cataloging system. The cross-repository integration where they were able to link to other repositories. And then, of course, the regular updates. So these were some of the things they mentioned that makes Africa Commons a go-to database. Now, the technical, next slide. Okay, so the technical considerations that we think would benefit Africa Commons, and mainly three things were mentioned: interactive timelines and maps. Now, even though this one exists, all right, they said they needed to have more of these timelines and maps so that they'll be able to visualize historical events and cultural movements and geographical changes over time. So maybe we need to incorporate more of these, the timelines and maps into Africa Commons. And then there was the issue raised about providing access for our users who have some form of disability. Then the most important thing which was raised was the periodic training. And as I mentioned, we had one in August last year. I don't have the permission of the university librarian to share the statistics, the user statistics now. But what we realized was that after the training program, the usage went really up. So I agree with users and patrons that I think we should have more periodic training as we have new students coming, we have new faculty coming all the time. So we need to have it constantly, maybe every quarter, we just let community know that this particular database is available and very useful for them. So on that note, I think I will end my presentation. I think that's my last slide. Is that it? Yes, that's my last slide. Yes. So thank you very much. And I'll wait for more questions. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Perpetua. So I'm now going to hand over to George.
Thank you, Liz. Am I sharing my screen?
Yes, George, at the moment we see I think one of your middle slides, not the first slide. Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. So just give me 1 minute. I'm trying to set up. There's an icon that comes up to my. Anyway, that's fine. I mean, I teach African history, and I do a lot of stuff on we deal with colonialism, and then we deal with colonial archives. We look at a lot of primary sources also being involved, but I think I want to talk, more about my sort of kind of involvement with Adamatthew, research, Adamatthew research skills, which has to do with, the use of primary resources, from various colonial and imperial archives, and very importantly, trying to sort of assist, instructors at the university and students know how they can incorporate and sort of integrate these kind of sources, within the teaching and learning process. But I do want to start off by saying, just hold on, one thing.
George, just while you're pausing, the slides aren't quite full screen, so we don't see the whole slide at the time. I don't know if you have.
Do you wanna help me and pull up the ones that you have? I'm not exactly sure. Do you have some for backup? Sorry.
Jenny might have a backup. If you're able to keep talking. Oh yes, here we go. Perfect. We've got your backup slides up. Thanks, George. So yeah, we're back in the right place and we're ready to go. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. A lifesaver. So I'm sort of trying to talk about like what the digital research resources and African studies, and I sort of want to start off first by talking about the importance of the use of this type of resources and what that has done for African studies, and particularly history, but not just history, but the other subjects such as anthropology. And I want to say that the use of digital research resources has kind of really transformed the way that we teach African history during the past 10 years or the past 20 years or so. And one other thing that using digital research resources has done has been its ability to sort of mitigate against what we call knowledge production and consumption. So it's sort of expanded and sort of diversify how we contribute to knowledge and how we consume knowledge. One other thing that the use of digital research resources has done has been the sort of accessibility in African studies. So a lot of resources that were not previously accessible have now become accessible in how we sort of teach and understand African studies. But there's also another point that I want to make about the use of digital research resources in the teaching of African history, which is sort of in response to a certain type of pushback that we have had. And the pushback has been that the use of digital research resources has sort of robbed learners and researchers of what is usually called the archive experience. And the archive experience has to do with that particular moment where we typically go to a live archive, and then we experience, the materials firsthand by actually handling them. And the pushback to that is that what digital research resources has done is that it sort of acted as a complement. It sort of complements the archive moment as opposed to be a threat to archive moment. Next slide, please. Yeah, and I want you to, and I've been doing a lot of work with Adam Matthew research, which is a primary resource database, and is sort of kind of organized around some sort of learning tools, case studies, practice sources, data sources. All of these sort of constitute what you might refer to as modules. And the different sort of essays or contributions or pieces that are provided by different contributors are sort of centered around expertise of different scholars and teachers. One other thing that this resource has been doing is that it allows instructors or teachers and students to come into contact with primary source materials and resources that they obviously would not have been privy to without this resource base. And another way, like an important of this resource is that it acts as a sort of a platform for encountering diverse voices and reading against what we commonly call reading against the grain, particularly when we do, African history. And I think that one of the things that I think is really important about this is that it's coming at a time when there are these conversations about Black Lives Matter and decolonization of the curriculum. And so I think this is one of the resources that sort of speaks to those kind of conversations. Next slide, please. And here I will just talk, lastly, in terms of how we can integrate this type of resource into teaching and learning. One way by which we can integrate that into our teaching and learning in colleges is sort of what I call applicability of research or evaluation questions. So all the pieces, excuse me, all the pieces have a set of evaluation questions that allow students to be able to apply them in different research or assessment categories. One other thing is that the resources provide students some type of rare materials or rare records that are embedded in colonial and imperial archives. And some of these records include posters, newspapers, government reports, letters, and memoirs. Another way by which this resource is really very useful to teaching and learning is that you can actually incorporate the themes that are being addressed within this resource. You can incorporate them into a seminar class, a seminar class lesson, and you can also, of course, incorporate them into a lecture course. And I will just talk, one other last aspect, and of course, there are many different ways that you can incorporate this into teaching. But I'll talk about visual teaching aids. One way of sort of using this is it acts as a visual teaching aid in the sense that there are videos, there are videos within these resources that explain how research is done. It explains how historians do research. And students are able to sort of copy, or learn from those videos, and those videos sort of help students to be able to navigate their own sort of learning materials within the class. And I'm just sort of, I don't know if this is going to be possible for me. I wanted to just say the last thing by going into trying to see if I can actually get into the website and just sort of show how it looks like. Jenny, do you think you can stop sharing? And then I try to just, okay, thank you. So let me see if this is gonna be able to lead me to sort of, just very quickly get into the resource side. And I'm here, I'm using my my login access details. But if you sort of subscribe to the resource and you are able to log in, this is how it looks like, where you have content, and then there's a set of modules. The module that I'm particularly involved with is the one that is called Interrogating Colonial Documents and Narratives. And there are a lot of pieces here that sort of give instructions both to instructors and to students, but most particularly to instructors, and how they can use these pieces to incorporate them into their teaching and learning process. And then I think I will stop there, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. And then Siya, we'll pass over to you.
Thank you, Liz. Let's see. Is my screen visible?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, thank you, and welcome to everybody. Thanks for the invitation to the SCOLMA team for participating in this series. So today I want to talk about a story that begins in the African Studies Library here at Cambridge University. It pertains to the discovery of a very rare and important manuscript about a seminal conference that was held at Makerere University College in Kampala in 1962. That is the gathering of the Conference of African Writers of English Expression. And I should say to the archivists and curators in the room that this photograph has been manipulated. It's not a torn archival fragment at all. It's been edited. Now, the idea of the conference was to bring together promising and established writers, magazine editors, critics, and publishers to discuss the future development of African literature. It marked the beginning of the debate about the status of English in post-colonial African literature, and has been widely recognized as a landmark in the cultural reawakening of the African continent. Now, I share this background if only to talk about what I've titled as the life cycle of a footnote through African studies digital resources, and how an idea that in a way was stimulated by the discovery of this document manifested and sort of sent me into other archival digital resources, which in a way completed the narrative arc of the story. Now, before I encountered this manuscript, as I've mentioned, which is a treasure trove of all the collected papers which were presented at this conference, and one of a few original copies that survive, I should say, my understanding of the breadth of the conference's intellectual and cultural significance amounted to a singular footnote, which, as we shall see, evolved into a richer understanding of the making of post-colonial African literature and intellectual culture. I should mention that this was only possible through the triangulation through African Studies digital resources of the material found, the names of conference delegates, African literature publishing firms, and Black periodicals which the manuscript usefully enclosed between its pages. Now, to use but one example, the appearance of the conference participants on the opening pages of the manuscript led, as I've said, to a feverish search for a generation of little-known African writers, and whose literary footprint in the second half of the 20th century was writ large in a wide array of African studies digital resources, many of which have benefited not only my research in 20th century African cultural production, but my teaching on these intellectual and cultural dimensions too. Now, one of these Kampala-based cultural institutions or intellectual forums was Transition Magazine, founded in 1961, shortly before the Conference of African Writers in Kampala, as we've mentioned. Now, some of the debates of the post-colonial African intellectuals who gathered in Kampala spilled over into the pages of transition, and the magazine remains an important resource for the understanding of African intellectual and political thought. The entire run of Transition is available as a digital resource on JSTOR following its acquisition by Harvard University's Hutchins Center. Still on JSTOR, the other important digital resource which has been indispensable to my work and teaching, and which has enabled me to enlarge my erstwhile thin footnotes, especially in relation to 20th century Southern African history, literature and culture and political activism, is the primary source database called Struggles for Freedom, Southern Africa. Now, in South Africa and across South African universities, we are also fortunate in having a vibrant intellectual culture, and I should say a commensurate archival digital resource network to feed and enrich the work of researchers and the broader global community. Exemplary digital archives in this regard are Wits University's Historical Research Archive in Johannesburg and the University of KwaZulu-Natal's Digital Innovation South Africa resource, where the listed primary sources on this slide are available for consultation online. And I think Liz, in her own presentation in the beginning, also shared the importance of the digital innovation resource. Now, before I, in a way, conclude my brief remarks, I should say a little bit about my own practice as an educator and what I consider to be the role of print and digital archives in the classroom. As a scholar of African studies and African history, I encourage all my students to develop their own understanding about the past and to make use of primary evidence to present and sustain historical arguments. I believe this helps them think critically and outside the frameworks of inherited knowledge projects. In my seminars at Cambridge, I have not only used the rich collection of the Royal Commonwealth Society, which we heard about in the first SCOLMA session, but have also ventured to include digitized radio tapes from the BBC's African Writers Club to examine the intellectual and cultural initiatives led by the first generation of African intellectuals in the 1960s. Now, these digitized radio tapes, of course, are still currently unavailable due to the cyber attack in the British Library. In fact, when I used Africa Commons a few months ago, I was happy to see that some of those radio tapes were also linked to the resource in Africa Commons, which I thought was a very good collaborative effort. As an educator, I have found that using digital and textual sources to teach modern African history, as George has mentioned, has great pedagogical value, for it has enabled my students to think critically about the production of history and the use of historical research methods. It has enabled my students to consider archival silences and how erasure is constitutive of the archive itself. And most importantly, I think it has generated interest for innovative essays and dissertation projects, including interest for further doctoral studies using these collections. This, in my view, is testament to the enormous possibilities presented by the availability of primary African studies digital resources, about which our work and understanding of the African past would be all the more poorer without. Now, to those who are interested in the links to these digital resources I've mentioned, I believe they will also be shared. They are available on the slide and should be available for you to access directly through your devices in the chat. I look forward to our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everybody for those incredibly rich and interesting perspectives on the topic. In order to allow the audience some time to ask questions, I'm only going to, in fact, make a brief comment, and then I'm going to we'll stop the recording and open the questions up to the floor. I think I guess the main thing that well, there's so many strands to pick up here, but I guess there's two that I was really interested in. One is the increasing diversity of the types of material available digitally, and I guess probably 10 years ago, a very large part of that material was from various kinds of state or official archives, and there's a huge diversification of the amount of the types of material which are now available, which is obviously, as Sia pointed to, broadening the way that students can access the past and think about challenging historical knowledge projects in really interesting ways. But I guess the other issue that really struck me across the four presentations was really what George described as the archive experience, or the ways in which accessing primary sources through the digital platforms offers so many different kinds of opportunities, which I think are also very rapidly in development. So, I mean, thinking through, going back to George, the ways in which that AM digital platform is thinking about teaching research skills and different kinds of ways of prompting different kinds of research skill development in students, and the ways in which the Africa Commons platform is using effectively forms of kind of social networking and other kinds of knowledge organization features to provide different kinds of directions of access, which are moving very much away from kind of archival hierarchies, but really thinking about different ways of kind of moving through the material, all of which is really interesting. As someone who works in collections, and this is my kind of closing kind of question, as it were, I wonder, and it's very much an open question, where this leaves researchers, and especially new researchers, not so much in terms of the archival experience and the kind of physical and material access, but in their understanding of archives and provenance. How does kind of accessing material through these digital platforms shape the ways in which students might understand the historical journeys of collections, or the kind of historical patterns of collections that have shaped what remains? So, and I think that's an open question. It's something which I've found quite difficult to teach. It's something which came up, I think, even in the previous volume in relation to higher education in Zimbabwe. Dadzie Njica's essay in that collection points to the fact that students might find it difficult, especially in that early point, to even kind of distinguish between primary and secondary sources when they all appear, as it were, in the same on the same screen. So I guess that's kind of my sort of my provocation, and I will then hand over really to the audience. I'll see if I can pick up some questions in the chat here, but thank you again ever so much to all of our speakers.